issues that the police are attending to right now, but with that, I'll take a motion to adopt the agenda.
So moved.
All those in favor? Aye. Okay. So first up, external agency funding.
Okay, Mayor Maher, members of the board. As part of the annual budget development process, a piece of the budget is something called external agency funding requests. And those are requests that we get in mainly from nonprofits that ask for funding from the town. On the whole, it's generally a relatively small cumulative number, but we haven't had a policy in place guiding how that process should work. Although there was a draft policy that was developed a number of years ago, but it was never implemented. So we took that and tweaked it, and it basically outlines how that process should work, and it does identify that it should run parallel to the budget development process. The policy also states that the request should align, and the organizations that request funds should align with the town's vision, mission, and values. Those requests should support the goals of the town, and that there's a formal application process that folks should go through. And in addition to that, they should be present in person to make their requests and be available to answer any questions that the board might have of them. So that's very broadly the external agency funding policy. It also states that there's no guarantee that anybody's going to get, number one, any funding, or number two, the level of funding that they've requested. Ultimately, the board decides on all of those. Parallel or along with the policy is the application. And this is where you get into the details of really formalizing the types of information that the town is asking for. So some of the items in the application that would be required to have a completed application, which is a requirement, is an organizational chart, a listing of the board of directors, the articles of incorporation of the organization requesting funds, their federal tax return for the previous year, any audited financial statements for the previous year, the current annual operating budget, and the projected budget, along with any 501c3 information and proof of their 501c status if they are a 501c3. So and as well as what the request is and how it benefits citizens of Waxhaw. So from this, what we would do is put together a booklet or a packet for the board to consider, containing all that information for each one of the organizations that request funding. And again, they have to have a completed information with all this. And this is how this came about. We ran into one organization in particular this past year that didn't have all this information. So under the new policy, they wouldn't be allowed to be considered for funding because they would not have submitted a complete application. So that cleans all that up. Now, it's still the funding determining for the. So I'll make a recommendation on funding levels, and then the board, through the budget process, makes its decision on what that appropriate level should be. There's no scoring criteria to score out a request. I mean, it is, at the end of the day, to a certain level, it still is subjective, but at least you will have a complete packet of information on what the organization's mission is and make sure they're legitimate, valid organizations and serving the citizens of Waxhaw with their request in some way. So, and if we can talk about any specific issues related to this, but it is on the agenda for consideration. But if there's issues or more questions, or you think it needs more work, we can take it off and talk about it some more in a different format.
Okay, open it up to discussion. Comments, questions? Paul?
On the application, there is no place that I could see where the percentage of how much money goes to the individual or services. Is there a way that we could get that percent? Most of them have a percent. If it's less than 5%, normally they don't have much in operating.
So on section 10, under budget allocations, it says percentage of annual budget allocated to salaries and fringe benefits and percentage of annual budget allocated to operating expenses.
That helps.
Does that get to,
Yeah, that helps.
okay. And just,
Gotta deduct that off of what,
yeah.
100%.
And just, for clarification purposes, so the policy, the external agency funding policy is what would be approved by the board, and this sister application would go with it, but we wouldn't need, if you want to add some things to the application wouldn't have to come back to the board to be changed. That could just be done administratively. The policy would have to be, does that make sense?
Yeah.
I mean, the policy is attached, the application is attached to the policy, but you don't have to bring the application back to the board to amend it. So there's some flexibility there to,
I would like to see the percentage that actually
Okay.
goes funding to an individual instead of it being operating cost or payroll, what actually goes to an individual or to a function that actually serves the community.
okay.
Normally, 501c3s know how much that is. They have a percent.
So,
Like, there is, for instance, there's some that have 99% is payroll and 1% goes to,
so let's say, so just,
see what I'm saying?
just so I'm clear, so let's say the Humane Society asked for $2,000. And let's say the Humane Society has 5 full-time employees. I'm making that up, I don't know. So you're asking for,
The percent that actually, of their total budget actually goes to recipient,
okay,
not to payroll and not to capital and not to operating costs. What actually would get
How much of their
Funded.
budget goes back to the,
to an individual rather than, because that's really how you judge, to me, that's how you judge a 501c3. Who are they serving? There is some that came in front of us that really was 95% was going to their payroll and 5% was going to the people that need service. So that was not a good good thing for a charitable organization because they're really for themselves profit.
all right, so the percentage of annual budget allocation to salaries and fringe benefits does not get to what you're,
I just want to know how much actually goes to they know that. I don't know how you say that, but actually goes to recipient.
okay,
And I think that's really how you judge them. Most of them, if you're less than 10% that uses for operating costs, they're very charitable. They're actually giving it all to their recipients. And it's not going to payroll, it's not going to operating costs, it's going, 90% is going to individual. that
okay,
needs.
we'll sit down and
You
see if
understand what I'm saying?
we'll sit down and get a better, clear.
just a point of clarity, if the requirement is you're a 501c3, which means then you have to fill out a tax form. So one of the requirements would be turn in your taxes, or we don't, as part of the policy, or we don't loan you money, or give you money, that's not a loan.
Yeah.
On the tax return, when you fill those out, having done that, you articulate your program dollars and any money that goes to outside of the program for salary, operating, et cetera. So it's right on your tax return as a 501c3. So as long as we're requiring it, and as long as we're requiring them to be a not-for-profit in the policy, then I think we should be able to get that.
Yeah, they have a breakdown.
Yeah.
Okay.
Other questions, comments?
Just to
Brenda?
clarify, when we give money, are we allowing them to use it for salaries and, fringe benefits?
Yes.
Or not? I thought we had decided not to do that.
No, you can, the town has put no restrictions on, an example, Museum of the Waxhaws. So that goes into the pot, so to speak, and it's divided up amongst different parts of their operation. But the town can put any kind of restrictions on the use that you see fit.
My personal opinion, because I was going through a list of things, and I think where you were going, Brenda, if they're going to describe a service they're providing, they ought to be able to articulate how the town money helps with that service and direct it towards that service.
So under section 2, purpose statement, provide a brief statement of the public service to be provided.
With this funding.
Yeah.
And if they can't define that with the funding, I wouldn't think that we would we would be paying salary for people.
I agree. I personally don't think we should pay salaries or fringe benefits for 501(c)(3)s. Just services, money to be used for services only.
And just what you may hear from the organizations, oftentimes it is the people providing the service. I mean, it's,
And that's fine, and they ought to be able to bring it back in terms of a defined project, and here's the cost of that project, of which
Okay.
this is how we're gonna allocate the money.
okay, just so I'm clear, because we will add that, just so the consensus of the board is not to allow any town funding through the external appropriation process to be used for salaries.
I think we need to be careful on that, though, because we've already deemed the fire department, and, I mean, they pay salaries for their firemen, so,
But their requests have come in for specific equipment. It's
Right.
not whether or not you have salaries, it's the project that you're bringing forward. We're gonna use it for dog licenses and spay and neutering. That's a specific project, which is, hey, that makes sense, how they get it done, but we're allocating all this money for that project.
So I'm still looking for a consensus that that's what, and we can include that, it's straightforward.
I'd like to back up to what Paul said. The Humane Society, for instance, nobody receives cash from the Humane Society. I mean, if they don't give food out or anything of that nature. We can't specifically say because all they do is provide services, and that's all their expenses are. And so, yeah, they need, but to give one particular project for the Humane Society, I mean, they have a lot of dogs. I mean, one project is one of 3,000 or something in a year. So how do you do that?
I'm gonna help fund the spay and neuter clinic. Simple project request.
Okay.
We're asking 10 organizations for outside agency funding, and if we get all 10, then we can pay for the whole thing.
That's easy because that is usually an outside. I mean, a vet comes in and does
Right.
it, and they're paying that vet to do that
Right.
project. Yes.
So
Okay.
if we're doing that, I'm sorry. So if we're doing that we're not gonna pay for payroll or fringe benefits, then we could do capital projects for them? Because that's basically, some of them would be, like the museum would be a capital project. It would be an investment on repairing something or purchasing something. Because that's really all they do. They don't have an outreach program. You understand what I'm saying? I don't know how you would designate that. The reason why I was asking for the percentage, so I can actually see if they're really a 501c3 or they're a corporation hiding behind a 501c3. Because there's a lot of corporations that hide behind a 501c3, and 90% go to payroll and fringe benefits. There is one in particular that it's in Union County that came before us that was 90% that went to payroll and fringe benefits. And I was deeply depressed about it because it was something that people really have a need for. I don't want to embarrass that particular 501c3, but it has come before our board. And I don't think, I'm with Brenda, I don't want to see us paying for payroll
Right.
and fringe benefits. I could see there's some things that came before us, like a place for Anna or whatever it was, for the cancer people, I believe it was the name of the thing, that 99% of it went to the recipients. None of it went to payroll or insurance or the light power bill. They were doing it all on good faith. They were actually doing the work and not actually paying themselves. Because a lot of them, what they do is they hide, they have a job, they're paying themselves by having a 501c3.
And I think the whole point of the policy is to, once and for all, clean that up and put some rigor in it. Fred?
I think I'd rather be more positive in what everybody's saying than negative. I think if people are going to bring us specific projects, it makes it easier for us to evaluate, do we want to give them money or not? I don't think it's up to us to tell them what not to spend it on. I'd rather tell them what they're gonna tell us what they wanna spend it on, and if we like what they say, we fund it. But I did wanna compliment you, Warren, for getting into this, the alignment with the town's mission, vision, values, and so forth. I think that's very important, in the process, number two.
I'm in agreement with Fred there. I mean, I think we need to specify a project, whether it's a capital project or whether it's a service that they're providing project. We will fund projects, not overhead.
Yeah, and I think also, if it's project-specific, then the next year, it's easy to audit. Did you or did you not do anything to that project, with that project, for that project?
There's
So
accountability.
I had time on my hands today, and so I went and did some digging at different smaller towns across North Carolina. And what was consistent was, for those that do it, not all of them do it, but they in essence ask for a description of the project or public service provided that benefits the town, and if the town isn't doing it, what would it what would be the greater expense cost to the town if we didn't do it? So in other words, a cost benefit to the town, if you will, in terms of the project. And I think that's what you guys are
Yeah, I mean,
getting at.
Warren's hit it on 2B.
Right.
How does the funding, how will it be used to support the goals of the town?
So I think, yeah, that,
Okay, so I need to make sure that when this comes back, it's consistent with that there's a consensus that, okay, so I'm hearing it needs to be project-specific, not related to salaries and overhead. And we do have in Section 8, number of citizens served, but, so that gets to some degree at what you just referenced. So project-specific cannot be used for, matter of fact, in the purpose, that's where that'll be identified. Strictly prohibits use of funds to support activities, political party. Okay, then it cannot be used for salaries and overhead, must be project-specific. Is that, so there's a consensus there? Okay, so you've got that. Okay, so Kathy.
see heads nodding, yes.
Okay. So you see me and we'll add that statement. That will go in the policy.
Mhm.
Yes. Okay.
So the only other thing that I looked at, or I found, and I just throw it out there for consideration, that number of the towns also describe two elements where you're ineligible. And that is if you turn in paperwork and you have a budget deficit, just, hey, you can't make it without our money, then maybe we shouldn't be in, but they put it in the policy so it's very clear. And then also, so they get the full financial picture, if you have cash reserves that's greater than a year's operating budget, why are you asking us for money? So they put that in there. It was an interesting financial check and balance. I don't think we have that issue right now, but it's something that to consider going down the road in terms of how to look at and why we look at do the financial rigor on it. Because we've been struggling with getting things in the past, but it gets back to your point too, Paul.
I'm full agreement with what you said, except for the negative profitability or
Budget deficit.
budget deficit. What happens if it's like Union County American Red Cross and we had a national disaster, and the next year they came around and they are negative in the hole because they paid out so much, blankets and so forth. I think we shouldn't put that in the policy. I think we should have an exception that we would have to make up our mind at that point, because I'm agreeing with having more than 1 year of your operating costs in the bank and not using your own money. I'm totally agreeing with that, because that's what a lot of them do.
Yeah, the point of the budgeted deficit was not to reflect what you lost last year on a balance sheet or an income statement, as much as it was, as you turn in your operating budget for the year, if you're already planning to be in the hole, there's a challenge there.
Future budget.
Yes. Not previous budget.
Okay, well, I'm sorry. Red flag.
It was just as a red flag that the manager should flag it, kind of thing.
If we had negative previous
Right.
As far as the capital on hand, cash on hand type of thing, you also, I think, yeah, they're working on a capital campaign, and there's a lot of money in the bank now. I mean, as long as they explain why they have so
Right.
much, they have more than a year's overhead there. That I would just ask that for an explanation of why.
And there's some words that you can put around that these towns did that. It's
Right.
basically people that are hanging on to money, and you're asking for more. You got to be able to see that.
Okay, so related to that, but since this is on the agenda for, and it's not, we can bring it back, we can take it off the agenda for the regular meeting and bring it back with the revised version at the next meeting. Does that work? That way we'll have a cleaner version that everybody can look at and agree to.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
One more change to the agenda tonight.
well, and just so I'm clear, so just to beat a dead horse, so restricted to project-specific items, no salaries, no overhead. In addition to that, your cash reserves generally should not be more than what your annual budget is equal to, unless there's some sort of extenuating circumstances.
She got a capital yeah.
Does that capture the essence of what you all want?
One more thing.
Sure.
If we gave them money in the previous year, they should explain what they did with it, and if they used all the funding. There should be an explanation of what they used our money for, and if they used all our money.
Okay, we can put that in the application.
In
Yeah,
the
okay.
application, and that way we will know if we're getting duty.
Okay,
We only get duty for 1 year.
all right, so we need to amend the application, the status of the previous year's award in terms of, was it all utilized and for the purposes stated? Okay. All right.
Earl, you want a public comment section, or?
I just wanted to ask a question. Some organizations, when they come before you, don't have the projects already lined up. Some of those service organizations serve as the projects come in lead years, so that may be really difficult for someone that is coming up, and there's several that could fall into that category, that when they ask in March, they don't have a specific building or activity that they know they're going to give to. They do know that during the course of the year, there will be things come up that they have to address. So that may be a little limbo thing that you want to think about. If I came to you say, I am going to serve doing this activity, but those activities have not come up, and then in June, someone comes forth and brings that problem, and I have to serve it. So that may be difficult for some to outline a project that comes up during the course of the year. And you may want to put that into something like, can you tell us what you did the last year as an example of what's coming up?
It's what you think, not what Earl thinks.
No, I understand it. And you know what? Where my head goes is, I think we err on the side of caution at this point in time, because I think we've been loose up till now. But your point about describing what you've done in the past, I'm guessing that they would submit an application to Melody, and there would be could be a conversation there.
Well, it's important for them to come before the board to answer any kind of
Yes.
specific question.
Exactly.
And number 4, under the application process in the policy, does have kind of the coverall of the board may at its discretion evaluate any application without regards to the provision of this policy. So we can look at anything.
At the end of the day, it's your decision.
And that's in the policy.
Other changes, suggestions? Okay. Very good. Next up, engineering design and construction standards. Mr. Rory. then give us those first, please.
Oh, this is one big copy. I thought it was several.
No, it's one. That's just an example of,
Yes,
Paul, would you read it on that side?
right.
Give it.
Well, yeah, definitely the purpose wasn't necessarily for you all to read the contents of that document today, but it really was a follow-up of a conversation that we started, or at least I started with the board at a board retreat in the earlier part of this year, if I'm not mistaken, where I passed out similar handouts from different jurisdictions that said, hey, we're not necessarily there yet, but we're going to get there. And so this is a huge step forward in us getting there as it relates to the topic of design and construction standards for land development projects. This is horizontal construction projects mainly focused around the public infrastructure, so your roads, sidewalks, storm drains, things of that nature. So I don't want to get anyone confused that this has a vertical element. This is really for your land development activities. So just briefly on the board, we have kind of an outline of what we'll cover today, a little bit of context we're getting into right now. But from a broad perspective, this particular document, or documents plural, because I guess there is an administrative section and then there's the physical details themselves. And details and standards, you will hear me use those interchangeably, depending on kind of where you kind of come from within the region, maybe even the country. Some people refer to these as design standards, some refer to it as design details, but we can use them interchangeably today and moving forward. But this is really a component of a broader growth management kind of program and strategy as the managers outlined in this year's budget. And so just to give you all an update of the things that have been going on in the Development Services Department, and this is further broken down to mainly this kind of engineering division that you've heard Warren and the manager and myself speak about throughout the course of the year. These are some programs and project level activities that have been happening, and so as we kind of move through time, we have kind of this adoption of a town administered construction standards. That's the document that you have in front of you, or at least the two copies that are circulating right now. You will see as I move through each one of these bullet points, I'm putting a dash red line through these. That's intentional. And the dash red line is really to mean that it's never really an end date on any of these things. We're going, well, at least on the programs, we'll get to a project that does have an end date, but over time, and it'll show up later in this presentation, as we find out more with the standards, as we tweak them, fine-tune them, we may find that some work perfect, some not so much, and we need to be responsive to the ones that don't necessarily work as well as we had hoped. So we'll have to go back and revise them, and I've proposed a revision kind of time frame later in the presentation, but that's why there's a dash line and not a solid line. So since I've talked about this topic, you have those documents in front of you. A lot of work has gone on Kensington Drive. There's a little bit of shoulder work still left to do, so that's still a dash line, but the majority of some work that we had spoken about earlier in the year has been done. You'll see later on in today, one of the presentations that'll come before you will be about a pavement management or street resurfacing program. Again, a lot of...
Just a point of clarity.
Yes.
Kensington Drive's nearly done?
Well, nearly done, so there's some shoulder work that needs to get done to accommodate some drainage. We had...
But that's just on one part. I don't want the public to think that we're not doing the end-to-end work over the course of...
I'm gonna go over that in my manager's
Yeah,
report.
okay, that's all.
The stabilization side of it.
Stabilization side is done, that's fine.
Sure. So, pavement management piece, there's a street acceptance policy and criteria that was updated early in the year, and the board actually, believe, took action on that. And then you'll hear a little bit later about erosion and sediment control program. There's a couple of things at the top of this list that, quite frankly, are still ongoing. They were prioritized over the year a little bit lower than some of the things that have been marked through, but they're still ongoing and will be completed. Any questions on any of the information up here? So we'll kind of roll along, and so I won't read all of the text that's on this particular slide. A lot of it I've already introduced in terms of the broad purpose of this document is really a communication tool to our development community, developers, anyone in kind of the home building, commercial real estate industry, of what the town's expectation is as it relates to construction standards for public infrastructure. And so again, it'll show up primarily in the land development activities that will go on in the town. And it's, as noted in bold, it's really intended to supplement the UDO, which will be coming online, and the stormwater design manual that we currently have in place. And so there's a relationship between the construction standards or details with some of our other regulatory documents that we have. They're all interconnected. So real briefly, just the structure of the document itself, the administrative procedures, that's actually about a 20-page section of the document, maybe a little bit more, but it's very, very content rich. If there's anything that I would recommend you reading, if you didn't have anything else to do, is read those first 20 or so pages, because it does get into a lot of content that I think is easily digestible, regardless of what industry anyone may be coming from, but it's the key piece of communication information for folks who want to maybe understand what the document's all about, but don't necessarily need to get into the nitty-gritty details of how the calculations are supposed to work. So bullet 2, design criteria, that does start to get a little bit more nitty-gritty in terms of detail. And the specifications and special provisions, standard drawings, and then there's an appendix section. So we'll kind of run through those key elements real quick. I understand it'll kind of stretch your eyes if you're trying to read this on the screen. This is not really set up for you to read it on the screen. It's just to give you a flavor of what what those first 20 or so pages are really all about. So administrative procedures, there's a bit of an introduction in how to use the document. There's a piece about the fee schedule associated with each sort of review. Nothing about this particular fee schedule had changed. This was just a link to what our current kind of fee schedule is. Driveway permitting, it's a pretty big deal, and something that we're still working to get our town driveway permit process sorted out. A lot of our roads happen to be or a lot of the developments happen to access NCDOT maintained roads. They have a driveway permit process. We have a relationship in that process, but there are times where we're having something locally would certainly benefit us from an infrastructure perspective. So the design criteria, I think bullet B, the local street design criteria, that's a pretty important table. Don't necessarily have to get into all the details of the table, other than to say that table is really the backbone of what the expectations are to design engineers when we're asking them to design our local street systems. That controls the vertical curvature, the horizontal, so how much of the rideability feels like a roller coaster versus how much it feels like a neighborhood street. There's some other information about kind of cross slopes to help with drainage and things of that nature. So this is it's a very important table, one that any design engineer who's done any sort of site design would not be unfamiliar with that information. One thing that you will see is as you get to 40 and 45 miles an hour, which is a posted speed limit, you usually see those types of posted speed limits on thoroughfare streets, which are non-local or non-kind of neighborhood streets. When you get to that sort of a posted speed limit, what we're really asking folks to do is bring a different level of expertise to the table in the design process than us kind of specking out numbers. So just to state that differently, if someone's asking us what are the design parameters to use for a posted speed limit of 40 and 45, quite frankly, they shouldn't be doing roadway design at that particular level. There are some other documents that are published nationally that give you a lot of criteria to use and guidance, and so our expectation would be that whomever's doing that work would know where to go and get that information, as opposed to rely on town staff for something that significant. Any questions there before I move to the next slide? Okay. Again, specifications and special provision section, this gets into really a high level of detail around certain construction procedures we would expect, material strengths and things of that nature that we would expect. Again, if contractors, site design engineers, this is something that they would not be unfamiliar with seeing, but this would be the first time to my knowledge that we are producing that information locally and communicating those expectations out locally. And then the actual details or standards themselves are kind of broken out. Just as an example, the 300 series, this is where you would go to find anything you wanted to know about our expectations around storm drain design. 400 series, that gets into the water quality component. 500 series is erosion control, which has a relationship to a different presentation that I'll be up here presenting to you in the next few minutes, and so on and so forth. As you thumb through kind of the meat of the document that I've passed around, or documents plural that I've passed around, you'll see that each one of these subsections has a decent amount of content and very kind of detailed. Some may think of them like a shop drawing, but blueprints, detail standards, again, kind of all very similar lingo. So as an example, one thing that several months ago, I think maybe that was a February time frame, I'd mentioned was it was very difficult for me, at least, to find where our local street standards, local street details. And there was a range of sources that we had reached out to, I think, historically, to get that information. NCDOT subdivision regulations were probably the most consistent place. But what we did over time is we said, hey, developing our own expectations around these things would be very important. Here's an example. You're looking at a cross section, which is basically if you think about a piece of cake, if you got a piece of cake and look at it from the side, that's what we're looking at, a road that's been sliced like a piece of cake. You have kind of recommended pavement minimums, and these are minimums. If somebody says, hey, we think that we want a more generous planning strip than the 7 foot that you're recommending, or is this your minimum standards, then that's not necessarily a bad thing. What we are saying is you can't go below these numbers. Also, sorry, Jeff.
Just a quick
Yes.
question, Dennis. When you get to the subgrade, is there a standard for the subgrade? Because everything you put on top is dependent on what's underneath.
So if you turn back to the screen, there it is, right there.
No, but I mean, what is the subgrade?
That's the
Very
subgrade.
bottom one that says.
Absolutely. So here's where you would find it.
Okay.
We have
Meet a
compaction.
certain criteria.
Right. We have
Okay.
compaction standards associated with it. So that's where you would find it.
Good, thank you.
That's called a Proctor test.
And so each one of these recommended pavement schedules or designs are a little bit different based off the type of street that it is. So we would not expect a local street pavement design to be the same as a thoroughfare pavement design. Traffic volumes, the weight of the vehicles that are traveling across the different roads are different, and so there will be different pavement standards throughout the document that correspond to the specific road that hopefully correspond to the type of traffic volumes that it's going to receive. Also, there's some key notes. Sidewalks shall be provided on both sides of the street. So you see sidewalks kind of on either side. There's these little arrows actually mean things. We want the sidewalks pitched in a manner to where the drainage is, the public water is getting into the public storm drain system, and we're not draining back onto individual homeowners. So all these little details are, they mean something. They communicate expectations to the people that are laying out the site design. One thing that I will note that you'll see throughout all the presentations that I have today is kind of some of our older branding. All of that will be updated over time, but I just wanted to mention that, as you'll see consistently kind of previous logo being used. So
Dennis,
again,
I have a question.
yes, sir.
So, in the case of pre-existing, like for instance, the intersection at North Providence and Howie Mine running between the Butch's house and the Rodman home, right? That's a limited space there. How would that design, what could be done to improve it? That design probably still wouldn't fit in that area.
Right. So if you recall, several months ago, the board made a decision to give the town engineer certain latitude to make decisions as it relates to streetscapes that could address the real world condition. And so this document would allow for that, and the authority that you granted the town engineer position to do that is how we would kind of step through that decision making. I can't tell you what the answer is because I don't know all the details of the specific site that you're referencing, but if we know that we can't get a desired street section in because there's a building in place or there's a huge monument or a drainage feature that's unavoidable, what we'll try to do is get as many of the standard elements and conditions that we can get in that we believe are practical without creating adverse impact on those individual property owners.
Because I have a feeling that, especially in the downtown area, would come into play more so.
Absolutely it would. Absolutely it would.
I haven't gone through the whole document yet, but do you also have, this shows curb and gutter on it. Do you have one that has ditches along with streets?
There is.
Because, I mean, we have a lot of those in town.
There is. And Commissioner Hunt, just to kind of further answer your question, the sidewalk policy presentation that you'll see, there's information in it to address the conditions that you're referencing. I would refer to those as retrofit conditions. They're already on the ground. How do we make the best out of the situation that we have? There's some guidance in the sidewalk policy that will help step through how we would answer those questions. And so I'll provide a copy of that policy to you all shortly, and there'll be a time window in which I'll ask you to read through the policy and give some feedback on it. So just real quickly, the fundamental difference between these two street cross sections or two standards, one has on-street parking, one does not. So no on-street parking, on-street parking.
So think about Fallondale. Based on this, it's not wide enough. Planting strips aren't wide enough. Wrong trees planted in the planting strip. Site distance issues. And who knows what the base and subsurface look like. I mean, wouldn't have been approved under these regulations.
Speaking of trees, so here's a standard or a detail that shows how to properly plant a tree. And so on the surface, these are things that maybe we would take for granted, but depending on individuals' levels of experience and things of that nature, it can vary. And so sometimes the proper installation techniques can be the key difference between trees surviving early on and not. There are other places in the document where we start to reference tree species, but this particular detail really is meant to show the installation technique.
How much of this applies to the new build-out of Millbridge, the Lennar section, the new MI section, et cetera? Are they all governed under the old?
So they're technically governed under the old. We're working with them really on a case-by-case basis to try to get them to respond to the new standards that we have in place. And they've been, in my opinion, they've been responsive to that approach.
Good.
Just one question. Dennis, when you were talking about the road sections, you
Yes.
mentioned about Fallondale, and I understand that. Where do we prevent another Fallondale from occurring from a too narrow street? It's not in this document, but where would that be covered?
Well, I think it's a combination. It's a combination of subdivision regulations, but then the supporting construction standards and details. So I think it's the two regulations, and so it's the subdivision regulations would be in the UDO. And then so that would set kind of the regulatory framework, and then how do you physically build what we're saying you need to build?
Right.
So the dimensions that are shown here should correspond to dimensions in the UDO.
The new UDO.
And so I've sent this document in its current form to our UDO consultants so that that coordination can happen between the two. And I've kind of told them that if there's something on here that doesn't necessarily match with some other land use goals or other policy goals that are being developed or that we know about, to let me know so that we can have two documents that are speaking to one another, not in conflict. This is just another example out of a different series. Again, I referenced it earlier, the 500 series, which is erosion control. This pretty picture is a sediment basin. Again, there's the folks who should be doing the construction would be very familiar with this type of a treatment. This is really meant to handle the stormwater runoff during the construction phase. So there's several presentations, and if I were to jump back to the very beginning, there's several presentations where I've kind of showed these series of pictures. So sediment basins are meant to help that condition. The dirty water enters the basin, all the dirt kind of settles out, and much cleaner water is supposed to be exiting the outlet structure. But again, very detailed information, and there's a lot of it. So I surely don't expect there to be a lot of questions about the content of it right now, given that I just handed it out. But if there's questions about specific details, administrative section, any of it, feel free to reach out to the manager, and he can get that information over to me or those questions over to me. And so just in terms of next steps, there are some coordination issues that we've been working through at Union County and some of our utility providers. And just to not get into too much detail, but the right-of-way is pretty coveted space for public utilities, and so working out where to put gas lines versus where to put trees versus where to put water lines, things of that nature, that's what we're really working through to get some all get on the same page as it relates to that. I think we made a lot of good progress actually last week, and so hopefully these coordination issues will be starting to dwindle down within the next few weeks. And as we are getting new development proposals that are coming in, we're communicating about our standards, about our design details to the development community as they're coming into the door, so that they understand kind of where we're going. And we have had, in my opinion, a pretty positive response, because these aren't necessarily expectations that are any more burdensome or cumbersome or really significantly different than what's happening within the region. And so step 3, something that I'm proposing, is maybe an annual update of the document. As the document goes live, we will inevitably find something that got overlooked or something that we thought was a good idea that's turning out maybe that's not what we really want. And so having at least an annual process built in to update the document so that it's a living document and it's responding to real world development conditions is what I've seen most often, and what I'd recommend here. But again, some of that can certainly be discussed at a later point if that's not the right update frequency, but that's what I would recommend.
Any additional questions? You mentioned it's not dissimilar to the region, and I suspect Mecklenburg, we're repurposing some of the documents, which is good, so this is fully vetted. Within Union County, though, how widespread is this kind of rigor and discipline?
Within Union County, not nearly as as widespread throughout Union County as it is probably in Mecklenburg County.
Okay. Thank you.
So I think it'll probably represent a certain level of advancement. Monroe does have some stuff out there to. Okay. Well, you get to hear the same voice, different topic.
Next up, erosion and sedimentation control. Document 2. Just a clarification point on the previous one.
Sure.
Those are standards. You don't need anything from us. It'll be, our policy is at the UDO level. But those are things, as you finish them, you're implementing them as real time, correct?
Those are administrative standards, correct?
Correct. Okay, thank you.
So next topic, still in the theme of the growth management kind of program. It's sediment and erosion control, or erosion and sedimentation control program. And this is really, I want to quickly give credit to Chris Rice for a lot of his good work. I'm just up here speaking about the topic, but Chris has done a lot of the legwork needed to get us where we are today. So I just wanted to acknowledge him for that work. You've seen a version of this presentation a few months back, and at the time I said, hey, each time we make a little headway, you'll see me again, and we'll be talking about where we are in this chain of events to getting us to a point where we can start our own erosion and sedimentation control program. And so I'm back before you again. With this particular slide, we can just move down to really bullets 4 and 5. It's really where we are. We're kind of in this process of working with the state, Sedimentation Control Commission to get some final feedback on a model or a draft ordinance that we presented to them. That's what's in front of you right now. Once we get that final feedback from them on any changes that they're asking, the actual ordinance will be placed before the board for a recommendation to adopt the ordinance. If that were all to happen, we would communicate that information back to the state, and that would give them the confirmation that they need to then choose to delegate. Technically, I guess they could choose not to delegate, but all signs appear to be that they'll choose to delegate the authority for erosion and sedimentation control to the town of Waxhaw. So I just wanted to acknowledge where we were in the process in case anyone had any questions. I'll move a little quicker through this one because you've seen a lot of this information. Just real briefly as a recap, the enabling authority, I've referenced the North Carolina Sedimentation Control Commission. They are the organization that can enable us to, they can delegate the authority to us to adopt a local program so that we can basically handle erosion control locally without relying too heavily on the North Carolina Department of Water Quality, which is what we currently do, and which is not uncommon throughout the state, but a lot of jurisdictions that have taken this on have done it because of the responsiveness that they can have to the local issues and tailor the local ordinance to the specific needs of the community that they serve. So again, same series of slides, but these all represent issues that have occurred during the construction process, and these would all be sediment and erosion control issues where you have silt fences that are certainly on the verge of collapsing, and if they do, this water makes it into our public creeks and streams, so we want to make sure that we're setting ourselves up to not necessarily have those conditions. So just real briefly, some examples of some good conditions. This is actually a sediment basin. I showed you a construction detail for a sediment basin in a previous presentation, but this is one, and you'll see the baffles, some other measures that would represent what I'll call a good condition. And something as simple as washing the tires of construction equipment, washing them on the construction site before they leave and exit the public street is helpful. There's mud on the streets when it rains, that washes into the storm drain system and just creates problems long term. So I've given kind of an overview of where we are in the broader process with the state, or the broader schedule with the state, where we are in the development services permitting framework. This would show up again at two places primarily, at the plan and review stage and at the inspection stage. If we were to move forward and adopt a local program, we would have much more detailed level of review for erosion control on the construction plans themselves. We would use the standards or details that I just showed you in the previous presentation as guidance to make sure that designers and developers are setting up their erosion control measures according to the standards that we have in place. And then subsequently during the construction process, we would be inspecting to make sure that what has been built is what was on the plans that we approved, and if not, there are some enforcement measures that we could take to bring about some corrective action. So again, just a high level, here's what happens with the erosion control process. We won't go through all the details. I've kind of talked through them already. But I will take you all through an example that we used before. This is a site that we picked. I think the majority of it, if not all, may have already been built. But if we were to take over a local program according to a set of draft fees that have been placed towards the back of the packet that I sent you all, you will just kind of see how financially the fee schedule that's set up would break out. So there's kind of a piece where the mass grading, if you want to go and kind of mass grade a site, what does that mean? There's a fee associated with that mass grading. It happens to be $4,100 for this particular example. But then there's an individual lot grading fee. And so if we were to take over the program, these would be fees that would go back to the town instead of where they're going now. They go to the state under the state's fee model that they're using. Yes, sir.
And this is more towards, well, probably both of you. What's the corollary side of this, the impact staffing-wise, operating budget-wise cost that we'll have to
So the board,
step up to with the
board approved a sediment and erosion control officer in the current year's budget, so that is funded. So we will backfill revenue with this and other expenditures such as, vehicle, fuel, departmental supplies, and that sort of thing.
Thank you. Yeah, Fred.
I know that previously the building department was able to pay for itself basically with its fees. How do we do with this? Are we at that point, or are we going to be at deficit?
Well, just with this model, and this is a real live example, with the development that we know that is going to continue to occur, it will pay for itself.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just like the previous presentation, this is an individual lot setup or a certain level of standard setup for a lot grading scenario that we would, it's in the packet that you have, but it's something that we would communicate out to the individual home builders so they had clear guidance on where our expectations are for their construction drives, their silt fence, and this is all kind of based off of how the flow of the lot, the water flow or the lot grades. We clearly would not want in this scenario that I'm pointing to on the screen, we would not want the silt fence at the rear of the lot if all the water is flowing towards the front. We would not want to set up silt fence in this location. So just the details of the packet that you have, everything that's listed on this particular slide you have in your possession. You can look at that information. Feel free over time to ask questions on that. I'm asking that if you have any sort of questions on there, if you could get those to the manager within the next 30 days so that we can kind of close out maybe what any sort of the draft piece of it before maybe it's brought to the board within the next couple of months. So that would be a request. If that doesn't work schedule-wise, I'm sure we can maybe talk through that maybe after this meeting, or depending on what other things you have coming up. So
Does anybody on the board see a challenge of getting input back to Warren by the end of the month, and September 30th?
Say it again. What did you say? What was
He would ask, just on this,
Right.
feedback on this document by September 30th. Everybody okay with that? Okay. And Warren, you want it to come to you?
Sure.
Okay.
And if it helps, what's in front of you is a model ordinance that has been developed by the North Carolina Sediment and Erosion Control Commission that was amended for a jurisdiction locally that we got positive feedback from the state on. So there's nothing in there that I would say is landmarking or strikingly different than what's being used in Union County already. So a lot of vetting has occurred at multiple levels, so it won't be coming to you all unvetted. It has been vetted quite a bit and given a lot of positive feedback by the individuals in Raleigh who are ultimately going to make the determination of whether or not they want to delegate this authority. So I just wanted to provide you all that context. Yes, sir.
If there's a continued violation of a developer, is there a fee schedule attached to that?
There is. It's actually it's in the ordinance itself, the draft ordinance that's in front of you. I don't remember the number. Maybe. There we go. So there's a decent amount of motivation for. Absolutely. There's some decent motivation in there for folks to clean up their site if it isn't already cleaned up before we tell them to. So just an update of kind of recent events. So August 4th, so last month actually, Chris Rice went up to Raleigh to present this model ordinance, or it's not model at this point, draft ordinance to the Sedimentation Control Commission. He received some feedback there. There's still a little bit of pending feedback that we're waiting on from them. I'll just kind of move down.
And just in general, their feedback, I'm assuming, was positive. They just had some tweaks.
Minor tweaks.
Yeah.
Minor tweaks. And really the challenge we've had is getting feedback from them has really been about scheduling. I think that they had a project that was rather significant, that they were pulled, pretty much all of their resources were pulled from some of the work that we had asked them to do to handle a project that was given to them as direction from Raleigh, I think from the governor's office. And so that's kind of slowed up the response time that we've gotten from them. But once we receive that final bit of feedback, we would make any of those tweaks. If that feedback were to come after the 30 days that I'm referencing right now, we'll make sure that that gets communicated to the board so that you're aware of whatever that final tweak was that they were asking for. And then it would show up in front of the board at a regular board meeting with a recommended action of adopting the ordinance. Again, if that were to get approved, it would need to go back to Raleigh for a final kind of vote. If they were to vote in favor, then we would be given a time frame in which the authority would be passed over to us so we could officially start doing sediment and erosion control reviews, inspections, and enforcement. Any questions on any of this?
Good stuff.
So we get tired of you, so we're gonna bring Lori up now.
Okay,
Give you a break for a minute.
sounds good.
Code enforcement update. Lori Oakley. Thank you, Dennis. This is really good stuff. Really good.
Is there an extra?
Yep, we're good.
Okay. Mayor, Commissioners, Manager, Melody. The handout that I just passed out is actually the monthly report for the Code Enforcement Division. I'm going to be highlighting it in my presentation, but I wanted to give you a hard copy so you can actually see the numbers. I know certain people are numbers people, particularly the manager. He likes numbers, so they're on the paper for you. What I'm going to go over today is just briefly, I was here last May, a few months ago, and I'm just going to kind of give you an update on code enforcement. And starting again, I just want to briefly highlight the history of code enforcement in Waxhaw. In 2010, as I stated previously, there was a designated position for code enforcement, and code enforcement was rather proactive rather than reactive. And after that, in 2011, it switched and it became under the position of the building inspector. We hired additional building inspectors, and as you can imagine, as building increased and permits increased, then the code enforcement decreased. So I wanted to give you just a little bit of a snapshot in time. So code enforcement really began here in May. So looking at May through August, what we've done. So I went back over the last 4 years and looked at 2013 and that same time period from May to August, and there were 57 code enforcement violations. In 2014, there were 37. In 2015, there were 22. So as I mentioned previously, you can kind of see the decline in code enforcement, whereas on the flip side, if you had seen building permits, they would be rising. And now in 2016, in that same time period, we have 192 cases. So the number of violations, and that is actually on the handout that I passed you, actually on the back side of the first sheet. As I mentioned, so far we have 192 violations. I'm very happy to report that we have 171 of those resolved. So for a percentage success rate of 89%. Looking through them, I kind of broke them down by the different types of violations. Obviously, as expected, high grass ranked up there. Number one, it is high grass season. Right below it, which was a little surprising to me, was junk cars. So far, we have discovered 29 junk vehicles in Waxhaw, and I'm sure there are still more out there yet to find. But I am happy to say that of those 29, 21 have been brought into compliance. The majority of them have been removed from the town, and a few of them have been concealed in conjunction with our ordinance. I also have just a breakdown of a pie chart for you to show you, again, as expected, high grass leads with the highest percentage, followed by both junk cars and debris at 15%. And then signs right now is at 10%. Do expect that number to increase. I just haven't had a lot of time to devote to signs. I had a part-time person for about 2 months, and they switched to the events division. So it's been a one-man, woman division for the last couple of months. So do expect signs to increase. I do recognize I'm trying to get particularly like the bandit signs. They're always an issue. They're an issue in almost every jurisdiction you seem to ride through. But I do expect that number to increase. Meanwhile, while I'm working throughout town, I'm trying to focus throughout the town, but in particular, I have right now focused on two what I call gateway area cleanups. So I've looked at the east side and the Rehoboth Road corridor, and I just wanted to briefly touch over what's occurred in both of those areas. In the east side, I've had 5 junk vehicles either removed or concealed. I'm still working on 2 active cases. We've got 8 high grass violations that were remedied, 2 commercial vehicles removed from the right-of-way, 1 commercial vehicle, it was actually a semi-truck, removed from being stored in a residential area, 2 damaged accessory structures that were repaired. If you remember from our previous presentation, one of those was a shed that we kind of rallied the community to get that one repaired. Another one was a gazebo that has been mostly repaired. 3 parcels with debris and garbage that were cleaned up. 3 right-of-way obstructions, those are typically basketball goals that somehow migrate out toward the center of the road. And 1 minimum housing violation that is currently in progress. Over on the Rehoboth Road corridor, we've got 4 junk cars that have been removed or concealed and brought into compliance. Still working on 4 others in that area. Had 4 high grass violations remedied. Working on having debris removed on 2 parcels. And also have been out there several times for an RV camper violation that we've been informed that someone's possibly living in it. We'll continue to monitor that one. Every time we go out there, all the utilities are disconnected, so it's kind of a little difficult to try to prove that someone is living in there, but that is an active case that I'm working on. And then, in light of everything going on, there's a little bit of a revised timeline. As I stated, we started in mid-April, the division. Spring through fall was basically just getting it up and running, all these code enforcement cases that I'm bringing to you. I also drafted an RFP for a landscaper. Not a single firm submitted their bid. So I'm still looking for a landscaping company to contract with us to do work when we have these high grass cases. I'm also trying to work on getting a towing contractor. We had a code enforcement inspector for a brief period. That position's also available, so I'm looking for one of those also. I am actively working on drafting the new community preservation ordinance, which I talked to you, which will basically replace the town code or the code enforcement section of the existing town code. And ideally, we would like to have a kickoff meeting with the residents sometime fall or winter to talk about code enforcement and to also go over the draft ordinance with them, with hopefully a winter presentation and adoption date to you. And that's really all I have as a quick update on code enforcement. I'll be happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Questions? Will you be sharing the draft document with the full board prior to you going out to the public, just for awareness purposes?
Yeah, let's
Definitely.
do that and get your comments. And
Yeah, okay.
Can I was going to ask, just because it always comes up, the historic ventures.
I am actively working on that site. A letter went out almost 2 weeks ago. I got written confirmation that the contractor will be out there tomorrow from the contractor themselves, that they will be out there tomorrow. For a code enforcement standpoint, what I'm looking at is high grass. There's some debris on the site, and there's also 2 tanks that have stagnant water in them. From a town code enforcement, that's all that I can enforce. I do know that the property owner is still working with the state on grading or regrading requirements per the state.
And seeding it.
And seeding and strawing per state requirements. But hopefully we will see some movement on that site. This week, also another overgrown site might as well bring up is the former Piedmont Palm site up near the entrance to Curitan. I've had time tracking that owner down. They're out of Canada, finally got hold of them, and they're supposed to be bush hogging, cleaning that site up within the next 2 weeks.
Given how busy this state is with the historic ventures, is there any other options available to us to get to the grading and seeding?
From an enforcement perspective,
Right. Yeah.
And I've been working with Chris, with the state. We've been working, partnering back and forth with the state to get updates on that, so.
Yeah, and I know they're understaffed, so,
They are.
I mean, big time. Any other questions?
Yeah. What
Paul?
about Prescott Commercial and the YMCA lot? That grass is this high, waist high.
We can definitely, I'll have to look, there's a caveat that in our ordinance that says the lot has to be developed in order for me to enforce high grass. So for example, if, a farm, I couldn't go out there and enforce high grass on it. So I'll definitely take a look at the code, and see if that's enforceable. If so, I can definitely reach out to them. And if you see anything, please don't hesitate to reach out to me, because it's hard for me to get out and hit the whole town. So, don't hesitate to call me or shoot me an email. Sometimes I just don't see things that are obvious right in front of me.
Thank you, Lori.
You're welcome.
You have a question?
I just wanted to say that this department has shown tremendous success in the field. The east side is looking so much better, so we thank Laura for what she has done. You can tell it, we knew it was there, it is being acted upon, and we thank you very, very much for what is happening in that department.
Great.
Most improved.
Thank you very much. Street resurfacing. Dennis Rory.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fine. I got it. I'm familiar with it.
Just take one and pass it down.
You're all right. Feel left out. Thank you.
All right, the next topic is the street resurfacing program. You may hear it referred to as a pavement management program. Again, I wouldn't get lost in the terminology, but the topic is certainly how to really maintain our public street system. That's really what the broader topic is. So just briefly, kind of what we'll cover in this presentation. Try to keep it pretty brief, but it's just to go over why are we even doing this, what are some of the goals, where are we currently, how do we establish priorities, and getting into a little bit of scheduling information. So I won't read what's on the actual slide itself, but the purpose is, well, we're doing it because we care about our streets. Our streets, they communicate something about the health and economic vitality of any particular location, and so maintaining, our infrastructure and specifically our pavement conditions with this particular program, that means something to us, means something to the people who live here in Waxhaw, and so we as a town, we certainly want to be responsive to that and do something about it. So that's maybe a little bit of a summary of what you see up on the slide, but feel free to kind of read all the details, and I'll jump to the map as quickly as I can, because that's what everybody's looking at. So yeah, program goals, there are multiple ways to get to maintaining pavement or asphalt. Sometimes you can have a concrete surface, so I'll use asphalt here because that's the majority of our street types. But really, this particular pavement management program, it's really set up to, in a systematic manner, how do we want to go about prioritizing which streets do we go after first, the condition of the streets themselves, how much what type of financial investment will it take on an annual basis to maintain the streets at a certain level that we deem acceptable? It's really meant to answer all of those questions and then to give staff some guidance and direction on how do we annually maintain our streets in a manner that we don't let the entire network ever fall under a certain overall condition index or overall quality level. So that's really what the program is all about, what it's set up to do. I know I said a lot, and folks are looking at the colors on the map, so let me just stop there to see if there are any questions on what I'm saying before I
Yeah, so how many miles of roads?
how many miles of road. So in total, I believe it's 75.
About 40 of the,
About 40
of those are town.
Yeah, about 37 of them are town roads. About 40 or so are streets that we would expect to be in the town at some point.
So those are those orphans that we haven't gotten around to taking over.
About 26 of those would come in, and with the remaining, I guess, would be the state roads.
And just, well, are you jumping through to your next chart? What I got concluded was about 15% of the roads are needing some work.
So when you say next chart, are you referring to this one? or-
The current progress, where it said 58 and 27, well, that left 15% are in poor shape, and we probably need to do something.
Correct, and it's, I would love for it to be very linear and say,
Right.
yes, that's the answer. It starts to get down a little bit to what is the condition of the overall network that we will accept. Because we could say we want a perfect condition, 100%. Financially, that's probably going to be very, very infeasible. And so, and I'm not aware of anywhere across the country that sets that as a goal, quite frankly. But there is a condition at which we can accept the pavement, that it's in a very good condition, and annually we can just do things that represent a certain level of just annual maintenance to the streets that allow the performance of them to extend out much, much longer than what we probably have experienced on some of the streets that are in that 15% category that the mayor just noted.
I don't want to get ahead of you, but
Sure.
I'm assuming there must be a matrix on there according to how much traffic's going to be expected and how fast it will deteriorate, correct?
That's a factor. Those are factors.
So,
Those are factors. There are other factors like drainage. What's the roadside drainage condition? That affects the deterioration rate of a street.
Right.
Usually a curb and gutter section will not deteriorate as quickly as maybe a ditch section, because of how water infiltrates into the subgrade in the ditch section. And so there's a bunch of factors in there, and without going through all of them, all those factors kind of give you an output, which is your overall condition of the network. And I keep saying network because you can have a network condition that's classified as good to very good, and have streets within that network, individual streets that are in very bad condition and are failing. And so I think that's maybe what Mayor was getting at earlier. There is an approach, or there can be an approach that says, well, let's just take care of the 15 streets that are absolutely failing first, worst first kind of approach. That's attractive because it seems to solve the worst condition, and that's quote-unquote good. Well, it can require a lot of resources, a lot of money to fix the worst first. And so sometimes you can make a decision that says, hey, we have limited resources. If we put those same amount of dollars that we would put to the worst first condition to streets that actually don't need as much maintenance, you can maintain a lot more or much more of the network for the same amount of money. And maybe what you have to do is look at those worst first streets. Maybe they're not even in the maintenance category anymore. Maybe what they're in is maybe a capital type of effort, to where capital funds need to really be reserved to handle much more of a rehabilitation type of a condition. So there's a lot of those types of decisions that have to get made over time. And we're not at a point yet where all that's all figured out, but that's what this particular program is intended to allow us to make those types of decisions. And so how I think it would show up in terms of feedback, or in terms of communication to the board, is some level of draft decision-making. Kind of, hey, which streets do we go after first? Here's what staff would recommend, and I would make that recommendation to the manager, and I believe he would find the appropriate avenue to communicate that back to the board, so that the board's fully aware of maybe how those decisions are getting made. But this, just like I believe it was the construction standards, this is much more of an administrative program that you would have a lot of staff-based decision-making that would certainly go through the manager as well for his review and approval. So I know I said a lot and tried to answer probably a lot of things, so hopefully I didn't confuse anyone and address the questions that may have been out there.
Seeing as everybody's jumping ahead of the map.
Sure, yeah, go right ahead.
The one thing I noticed on the map, I says, there was a lot of streets in the lower categories there in the newer subdivisions, whereas I lived down in Hillcrest area. There were comparatively, 15 years older or 20 years older than the ones in the newer subdivisions.
Right.
What, would that just be poor quality, or was put in, or was that just higher traffic? What would cause that?
It could be a number of factors. It could be both of what you described. It could be a number of different factors, and also something that I actually made mention to the manager earlier today was that oftentimes what we visibly see and we visibly think is really bad may not be as bad as what we visually think it is when we start considering the other variables associated with how streets get evaluated. So I could look at a street and say, man, that street looks horrible. And then I could look at another one and say, that street doesn't look so bad. But when I start to factor in other things besides just my visual inspection, my initial kind of conclusion could be different than what I'm getting once I start putting more data points into the decision-making process.
Curiosity question.
Sir.
And this gets to the development standards and everything. So I'm looking at Prescott Glen in the new, in the commercial side. If I read that right, it's failed pavement.
I don't think it has a final overlay on it.
So that's
So
what it is.
Final overlay, that's correct.
Okay.
So the pavement thickness itself isn't fully there, and there's some sensitivity in the calculations that account for that.
Okay.
So if you drive on it today, I don't think that it's failed in the way that we probably would think about performance failing, but it's certainly, that's an indicator that something's off. It doesn't meet the condition, the minimum condition that was set in the program goals. And when you dig deeper into the details, chances are what it's catching is the final lift asphalt isn't on.
They do borings around town as well, or not?
Now, well, excuse me, in a couple of places there were some borings done, yes.
Other questions for Dennis? Paul, and then Fred?
Just one last comment. I mean, Jim, I think the answer is that there were really no standards in place when the subdivisions were done. There were no inspections, no real turnover. They just did them any way they wanted to. So back to the standards that you produced. Thank you.
I just have a curiosity question.
Sure.
There is roads that are in our town limits, they're not our roads, they're DOT roads, that are tar and gravel roads, that that we have town roads that connect to those, but they're blacktop roads. Our roads are much superior to the DOT's, even though the DOT's roads are much longer. So, for my instance, where I live off of Pine Oak.
Okay.
Okay? All the streets in Old Hickory subdivision are blacktop.
Okay.
But Pine Oak is a tar and gravel road, and they come through every 10 years or so, put another layer of tar and gravel on it, and then it washes out into the town's roads, because it washes out into the gutters, because there's gutters in the subdivision, and you get that gravel that runs across our roads. Is there something we can prevent that from happening? Because I got a washout in my corner that washes from my corner to my neighbor's driveway of gravel that comes off of Pine Oak.
So, I mean, I think the answer is yes, that's something that we can look at. I don't necessarily know if it
Or,
fits in this particular program, but if
yeah,
it's
I
something you
just
want me to,
don't- I'm just
yeah,
curious.
if it's something you just
and
want
I'm
looked
curious
at,
to
yeah.
how, is all the roads in the town blacktop, or some of them tar and gravel?
I'm not aware of any that we're maintaining that are tar or gravel. I mean,
I just curiosity, I mean, because a lot of streets where I grew up, you know, we had county that
Sure.
took care of the roads rather
Sure.
than DOT.
Sure.
And those mostly were tar and gravel roads.
Sure.
Because I'm from a rural area.
in a roundabout way, we've probably covered everything that,
Well, I see in the next step
Sure.
schedule, you had a statement in there, you're gonna come back, you're gonna identify streets, come back, obviously, to manager of the board, not only apply the principles, but which best fit budgetary constraints. So, have we established a budgetary framework for him already?
Yeah, we have $200,000 budgeted for resurfacing.
Okay,
So the question is,
so that's the constraint, or do you, or?
yeah, so,
okay.
so Dennis and Todd and I are gonna sit down, come up with a list and see how how far the 200,000 goes. And then on an annual basis, moving forward for next fiscal year, determine, okay, this is the amount of money the town needs to budget annually to make sure our streets are resurfaced on whatever schedule.
And so, let's say 200,000 doesn't cover some critical, as you guys go through, will you come back to us and say, okay,
Or present it in a way, if we don't do this, this is what you're gonna be, this is the impact.
yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Just give you
So
some
that's part
options.
of it.
Yes.
yeah, and that was part of what I was alluding to earlier when said that there's the worst first approach, and then there's other approaches, because within that that fiscal constraint, you can prioritize things differently.
And let's say it needs to be 300,000. Okay, so it may be a case where, okay, next year we're gonna go to 250, and then the next year we're gonna bump it up and meet the 3,000, so incrementally get to the threshold we need to be. I mean, I don't know what the number is, but
Right.
we'll present it.
Some of these are gifts that keep on taking, so,
Yeah, I mean, looking at this, you know, we talked about in our small group meetings, Lawson Drive. I mean, that's one that's, and Dennis talked about going in and basically, from a capital perspective, that's one that, is gonna have to be addressed in some form or fashion.
Warren, can you describe how the PAL bill funding plays into that?
So the state of North Carolina on an annual basis gives the town $300,000 for, it can be used for basically building roads, maintaining roads, building sidewalks, maintaining sidewalks, signage, so anything related to your transportation, so bikeways, that sort of thing. So, and we carve out 200,000 of that specifically for historically for street resurfacing. So the question is, does it need to be 300, does it need to be 350, you know, or what's the proper number to properly maintain, to get all our roads up to a certain standard and maintain them in a certain way moving forward?
And that 300,000 is based on mileage?
Yes, based on mileage and population. It's a formula that the state, so as our population increases, as our population increases and as we take roads over from these HOAs and subdivisions, that positively impacts the revenue we receive. Of course, as we take roads over, we're taking over more responsibility. So, and the state is more than, people know that what we get from the state for road maintenance typically for street maintenance typically does not cover the cost. So generally, cities are subsidizing or putting more money into that to make a workable program.
It would also appear that some of the roads that we've identified that we should own but haven't taken over for whatever reason, some of them are in good shape. We get those taken over and put on the Powell bill real quick. Just a thought. Other questions? Thank you, sir. Now you want to get out your sidewalk presentation and
That's a surprise. That's a surprise.
We'll make sure, and if you're short, I'll.
one short if you got an extra. Otherwise, we can just get it some other time.
Hey, you're fine, we can share.
Take it away. No, we'll share, that's fine. I wouldn't want the professor's notes.
I hear you. So last but certainly not least, at least for me today, because I think you guys probably heard enough of me for probably a few weeks, but this is the sidewalk retrofit policy. It's a draft policy. Again, kind of same format. I'll kind of skip through the outline pretty quickly and get to, what is this document? And so, Commissioner Hunt, just to follow up from an earlier question that you had about very specific scenario at North Providence and Howie Mine, the sidewalk retrofit policy is really meant to address some town goals around providing sidewalks in locations that are already built out. So the construction standards, they certainly can apply as well, but when you're dealing with kind of the real world conditions where there's a structure, a house, commercial building, parking lot, something that's already built, you have limited right-of-way availability, but you know that you want to get a sidewalk in there, this is really intended to help in those conditions. It's also intended to help us construct sidewalks that we've identified in different area plans and planning level documents. We've had a lot of dialogue over the recent weeks about certain projects that have been identified, but where's kind of that next step in terms of getting those built. This particular policy would help sort out some priorities around sidewalk construction. It would help sort out some decisions around design. And also where there's maybe no area plan or we have no area plan guidance or any other guidance other than a broader policy goal of having sidewalks everywhere throughout towns, or at least on our public street network, this policy is meant to help as well, because it involves a staff initiated way in which projects could get selected. It also involves a petition process as well if there's a sidewalk gap in a neighborhood or multiple neighborhoods and that particular neighborhood wants to petition the town to build a sidewalk. There is a process built into this. So I've kind of spoken a lot about kind of the purpose of this document, and then I did put up here a couple of screenshots about the actual policy statements. Again, this is a draft document, so you all get a copy. I can make sure you get electronic copies and hard copies for review and feedback on here, but the two policy statements that are very important, really, Statement A speaks to installing sidewalks on both sides of all existing thoroughfares. Highway 16, Waxhaw Marvin, these are thoroughfares. Highway 75. Having sidewalks on both sides of the street for a number of reasons has proven to be a much better condition from a safety perspective, a mobility perspective, a health perspective, to have sidewalks, one on the streets, but then on both sides of the streets. It limits having them on both sides of the streets limit where people have to cross the street, and it also allows people to travel on foot with a much limited interaction with cars than they would if they had to cross the street at any given point in time to get to a sidewalk on one side of the street. So that's a pretty big deal. And then B is there's a prioritization process. So it's not just grab a sidewalk and let's build it. It's let's prioritize that sidewalk based off some data. And so one of the handouts that I provided to you really gets to the prioritization criteria. I have some screenshots on the PowerPoint, but you also should have a copy in front of you that really gets to different criteria. What type of street is it? That really affects the amount of points that it could get. What's the traffic volume? Higher the volume, the higher the points that it gets. And if you think about it, the logic behind that is that the higher volume roads, those are generally the people moving roads, and so those are also where you have a lot more commercial activity and people that may not want to walk just for recreation, but are actually walking from some point of origin to a destination location. It could be to a grocery store, it could be to a retail establishment, but they're walking not necessarily just for recreational purposes. So we want to make sure that those streets receive proper attention for the people that are really using walking as a legitimate means of transportation. There's some other criteria in place that the schools and public colleges, schools, and libraries get a pretty high ranking, because we'll see a lot more pedestrian activity along those types of uses. And then there's a piece about kind of greenways and things of that nature. Earlier, and we've talked about it over multiple presentations, but there's some design guidelines. So Commissioner Hunt, again, just to maybe further answer your question, this particular slide in the design guidelines that hopefully you have in front of you, those are recommended ways to deal with retrofit conditions. It's some, here are the design goals: sidewalk width, planting strip width. If we can't meet those conditions, can we at least document maybe why we can't meet it? Maybe there's an existing building in place and we just had to meander the sidewalk to miss the building, or to meander around a utility pole. It becomes very cost inefficient and also difficult to construct if we're going to just relocate utility poles every time there's a conflict. It's easier to meander the sidewalk around that particular utility pole, and we're accomplishing the objective of getting, or the goal of getting sidewalk on that particular street. Also, and I'm leaving a lot of detail out of this particular presentation, mainly because we've covered so much detail over the other ones. I didn't want to get us too bogged down in the details, but I encourage you to read this policy as well. I think it's somewhere on the order of 15, 20 pages. I could be getting that wrong. But there is a public involvement process that's recommended, and it really is separated out by the street classification. I think that the table's fairly self-explanatory, so I won't necessarily go through all the details of it, but if anybody has any questions on it, feel free to let me know now, or you can let me know later.
Sidewalks down going to like to the line on the left side, that's Union County. Is there any plans for a sidewalk on that side as far as you know, for the DOT?
On the left side?
Providence Road on the left side.
I'm not aware of any projects that are planned currently. I would say that this type of document or policy could be used to address those types of conditions. but I'm not aware of an existing project that's planned and subsequently programmed in anyone's budget. And I'm speaking mainly of the county's budget.
So there's no prohibition on the town building sidewalks to connect parts of town that might be in an unincorporated area?
Now, the majority, if not all of these sidewalks would be within the public right-of-way. And so, excuse me, as long as it's a public street, even in the unincorporated areas, that public street's most likely maintained by NCDOT. And so they have had a history of allowing sidewalks to be within their right-of-way. They generally are looking to other entities to maintain the sidewalk over time, but in terms of allowing the sidewalk, they have generally allowed sidewalk in their right-of-way. So as just an example, we are actually inside this building right here, Waxhaw Police Department. So this particular policy would be used to connect certain sidewalk gaps, and I'll kind of show you if you can see the red line. So there's sidewalk network set up on the west side of 16. There certainly could be a logical connection. Also, there's another logical connection, at least on the surface, logical, and that would be sidewalks on both sides of the street, because it's a thoroughfare, and that's what policy statement A says, is we want sidewalks on both sides of thoroughfares. Another example, this is Kensington Drive. I think this is the elementary school. So I think the policy could give us some direction about going back and putting in a sidewalk on the south side of Kensington Drive. On the north side, maybe as development comes online, that would be a part of the expectation of a developer to build the public sidewalk, which is why it's shown in yellow. But again, retrofit, we already have development in place, so chances are there's not a developer out there that's going to build that sidewalk. We would have to most likely take that on as a town. Just next steps, and I can certainly, we can talk about this 30-day time frame, because I know that there's another one that I've requested some review from, or review on rather. But next steps, the draft policy, I'll distribute the hard copies and also electronic copies. I am asking for, the board to read the policy and give some feedback. I'll make, we'll look at it, make whatever changes need to be made, and once those changes are made, it would be redistributed to make sure that everyone understands what's in the policy document itself before it's taken to the full board for a recommendation to vote on this, vote on adopting the policy.
So same time frame in September 30th?
That's what I'm thinking, yes.
Okay.
And again, just the actual brand information will be updated throughout, but at the time that this was all being put together, this is kind of where we were.
So two questions.
Sure.
The trail system. See, Natalie's not listening, so. Does that factor into this
It does.
as well? Okay.
It does. It'll show up. There's a statement within the policy itself that speaks to consistency with different plans, and the Carolina Thread Trail is specifically noted. Also, the Park and Rec Master Plan is noted. And then I think there's a statement or two in there whenever we know that there's a trail crossing or anything of that nature, it's accounted for.
And it would be governed by this policy in terms of
In
being updated and
That's-
repaired, et cetera.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
And the second thing, it's kind of along the lines of the streets. Do we have plans to develop an inventory, how many sidewalks we have? We've had the discussion where there's no sidewalks and they want to know when they're going to get built. That's the other part of it. Do we have planned to have that kind of inventory in place?
That would be a part of an overall, what I'll call a sidewalk program. So yes, the policy is a portion of that.
Yeah. Okay.
So not necessarily as a part of this policy,
Right.
but as a separate effort, that's something that we would need to do to help prioritize which sidewalks we think should be built first according to our prioritization process or criteria.
And then, Warren, do you plan to come back similar to the road, just saying, hey, here's where we are, and right now we've set aside, I forget what it is,
It's 150,000.
150,000, but hey, that will work, or it may not work? Or-
Yeah, and it gets a little bit different with sidewalks, because you get into right-of-way acquisition issues, and, oftentimes, stormwater issues, so versus just, building one out here that's a pretty straight shot, and you got right-of-way might be simple, but some other ones might be. But yes, that's the
Okay.
long answer.
I have a question.
Yeah, Jim?
I know from years ago when I was on the planning board back in the nineties, I know we had when you developed a lot, you were responsible for the sidewalk for that portion of lot on the street at any public right-of-way, especially on 16, that type of thing. But sometimes there was an orphan way out there in the country, so you just put money into a fund which paid sidewalks someplace. They used it for that purpose. Do we still do that, or how's that
Like
handled?
a payment in lieu?
Yes. I mean, there is no set amount of money set aside to do, because I know there's a lot of, like up next to the food line, the back site on the Waxhaw Parkway, there's sidewalks, and there's 100 feet where the lot was never built. It's no walk there.
Yeah, I have not been a part of any of those arrangements since
Okay,
I've been
so
here.
that disappeared 10, 15 years ago. Okay.
We haven't received any payments like that, or
Either the money that went into that account it went someplace. Okay, sorry.
Other questions? Thank you, Dennis.
Thank you.
Final item on the agenda, Animal Control Ordinance.
I think you all got a copy of it in your packets.
Yeah.
I think back in April, it was amended, and we took care of a lot of the changes that we needed. But there are a few more that we are seeing need to be addressed. And as we go through this process, we may come to you with some more stuff as we go. There's some stuff that I'm not a big fan of in here, but it seems to be working right now. I may come back to you in the future. One of them is the number of dogs you're allowed to have per acre inside the town limits is 5 dogs. To me, if I had somebody who had 5 dogs in the kennels and in the backyard barking all night long, I probably wouldn't be real happy. But fortunately, right now, we don't have a problem with that thus far. And some of the other changes that we've made kind of addresses that anyway, so we should be fine there for a while. Under number and restraint of animals, you'll see highlighted letter C, with the chaining and tethering of the dogs in the backyard, both to animate and inanimate objects. We want to remove that. And what's highlighted in yellow underneath it is what we want to add. It shall be unlawful for any person owning or having possession, charge, custody, or control of any animal, excluding cats, to keep the animal off his or her premise unless the animal is under sufficient physical restraint of a leash, maximum of 10 feet long. It can be in a cage, brittle, or similar effective device which restrains and controls the animal, or within a vehicle not more than 15 minutes. Electronic collars are not allowed for off-owner property use. So basically, when you're walking downtown, you can have it in those kennels that are you keep in your car, or a 10-foot long leash. Also, when it comes to events, right now you're not allowed to have them in the events, but we also wanted to add to that, not only can you not have it in events, but if you'll see highlighted in yellow, not have within 100 feet of the event. Now, I mean, that could be subject to change later. Natalie and I have had conversations, but right now we feel like this is the best policy to have in place right now. In the previous changes, we addressed the fines, we addressed puppy mills and dog breeders. got that under control there. Right now, I think this will round up, the ordinance to where the animal control officer can have a little more leeway and clear up some of the terminology within the policy.
Any questions for Chief Ice? So in terms of tonight, because it's on the consent agenda,
I think Chaplin has typed this up with the changes, and
the copy we have still has the red in there and the yellow in
I
there.
think he's doing the official one for you all to sign tonight.
Did you hand that out?
Okay.
The ordinance is included in your packet, and for
Right.
those of you who have paper packets, paper copy has been provided.
And this is just a curiosity question. I should know this and I don't, so I apologize. Under 90.22, if you want to be a professional breeder, they register with the animal control officer?
He has to make sure you're legit.
Okay, and so your animal
There's
control
a lot of
officer,
puppy mills out there that are they're just,
but it's an official registration. You keep the records, you keep the files and all that stuff.
and
Okay,
then they're inspected.
okay. Any other questions?
I have
Concern?
a question about, how about exotic animals like Gila monsters and stuff like that? Can you take those for a walk down your sidewalk? I've had those come into, when I was a manager
What
at
monster?
Lowe's, a Healy monster. Looks like an alligator, but it doesn't bite.
Lizard.
I mean, it's a giant lizard. It's this big. They brought them into Lowe's on a leash. And the leash law, does that apply to chickens? Can you have the chicken on a leash downtown? I'm just asking stupid questions because people get stupid.
I'm gonna say no.
But it doesn't state that. It doesn't say what type of animal you have to have on a leash. And that, we have exotic animals out there that people are gonna bring out of the woodworks. Some people love that Healy monster, and they would love it, take it for a walk to show all their neighbors that they have one. Because I had to tell them to leave the building when I was at Lowe's because it was scaring little kids. Just, I don't know if we need to have a law like
We have,
Well-
9029 covers the exotic and wild animals.
Do you feel comfortable we could move ahead with what we have?
Oh, yeah,
Okay.
I'm fine with that, I'm just questioning
While it doesn't
that.
address the Healy monsters,
Yeah, they're giant lizards, they're
It's-
really big lizards.
You're prohibited from having a wild or exotic.
anything else?
Okay. So we'll have the real document tonight, the changed one, okay. Any other questions for Chief Ice? Okay, with that, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All right. See you at 6:30.
A commissioner on a leash, yeah.